Does consuming violent media make you a more violent person? It's a question seemingly as old as the concept of recorded butt-kicking itself. Back in the Victorian era, circulating libraries determined which books were fit for the middle class to consume. In the mid-1900s, the Motion Picture Production Code dictated what Hollywood could and could not depict in film. And today, though media is perhaps as liberal as it's ever been, there is still a persisting concern that excessively violent media, and especially those dang video games, are deteriorating the moral fabric of society and leading to the downfall of Western civilization. Or something. So, the question is, are these concerns valid? Should we be concerned about the rampant violence in media, or is it all just good old-fashioned fun? Does playing Call of Duty make you more likely to become a school shooter, or just more likely to remain an eternal bachelor? Hello and welcome to Psychology I.R.L, the show where I tear my hair out trying to make sense of the scientific literature for reasons not even I fully comprehend. This episode, social learning theory and violent video games. In previous episodes of this show, we've spoken about classical and operant conditioning, two concepts that make up the backbone of a school of psychology called behaviorism. I've mentioned behaviorism a few times in the past, but for those non-nerdy life-having other signifying normies out there, behaviorism was a movement in psychology in the early 19th century that strove to ground the field in concrete, observable behaviours. It largely developed as a rejection of what's called depth psychology, which is centered around delving into the depths of the unconscious mind. Thinkers like Alfred Adler, Carl Jung, and everyone's favourite incestual neurologist, Sigmund Freud, fall into this camp. If, when I say the word psychologist, you picture a dude lying on a couch with some old man sitting behind him with a clipboard interpreting his dreams, then you know what depth psychology is. Depth psychology was extraordinarily influential, and we can feel the ripples of its ideas to this day. But from a scientific perspective, it was problematic. See, depth psychology is what's called non-falsifiable. In essence, this means that you can never prove a depth psychologist wrong. Freud would say something like, "Your depression is the result of your father never reciprocating the flaming passion you felt for him." And you could respond with, "Well, I don't recall having a flaming passion towards anyone, really." And Freud would say, "Well, you see, that's because it was an unconscious flaming passion." And there's nothing you could really say to prove him wrong. Being non-falsifiable means that much of depth psychology is also fundamentally non-scientific. The whole point of science is to make a prediction, a hypothesis, and gather data to see if your hypothesis is correct. If the hypothesis can't be wrong, then it's hard to be sure that it can be right either. Now, that's not to say that non-falsifiable beliefs and frameworks are inherently useless, because that's not true, but they certainly don't fit within the realms of science. And in the case of depth psychology, they lead down some very questionable rabbit holes. And so, in response to this, behaviorism emerged, focusing on facts and logic and scientifically valid hypotheses. Behaviorism proposed a different account of why people do the things they do. Instead of unconscious forces and urges driving human behaviour, like Sigmund Freud thought, behaviorism argued that behaviour occurs when we learn from our experiences. This was great for giving psychology legitimacy as a science, because it's falsifiable. If you poke a rat in the eye and it salts its mother every time it squeaks, it will learn to squeak less, is a scientifically valid, if morally objectionable, question. We can test it and prove it wrong, which is important, because that possibility of being wrong is what allows us to do science. Behaviorism was important for other reasons too, such as because it helped combat the eugenics movement. Eugenicists argue that certain groups of people, usually groups that they conveniently don't like, should be bred out of the population to maximize the quality of the human genome. And many psychologists supported these movements, leading to the forced sterilization of around 64,000 people in the US alone. But behaviorism didn't concern itself with genes, it concerned itself with the experience. And what operant and classical conditioning demonstrated was that it didn't matter what genes a person was born with, it mattered what environment they were raised in. A person with perfect Aryan genes could become a snivelling waste of a human being, and a person with bad genes, whatever that means, could become a legendary hero, if that was what they learned to be. The environment someone grows up in is just as important, if not more important, than their DNA. In other words, behaviorism offered the nurture side to the nature-nurture debate, providing an alternative to eugenics. That's not to say it defeated racism or whatever. Eugenics movements persist to this day, and many behaviorists were themselves eugenicists, including Thorndike and Watson from our previous episodes, but at least offered an exciting alternative to forcibly sterilizing innocent people. Namely, not. So behaviorism absolutely served its purpose and contributed greatly to psychology today, but behaviorism, and especially the more radical strings of behaviorism, came with its own set of flaws. See, many psychologists felt that in behaviorism's pursuit of observable empirical behaviours, it went too far and ignored the influence of our internal thoughts and beliefs. Behaviourists intentionally separated themselves from concepts of the psyche because they were embarrassed by Dr. Daddy issues, but in doing so, some theorists believed they were too quick to throw mental factors out of the equation. Like, sure, philosophically, you can't prove that other people have thoughts, or that those thoughts impact their behaviours, but surely it's not an unreasonable assumption to make. Humans aren't robots with a rigid set of input-output responses. I mean, they might be, but surely not, right? Not to mention, behaviorism often overlooks the influence that social factors can have on our behaviour. For instance, think about the fact that we can be classically conditioned by watching other people. Classical conditioning, for those of you who don't remember, is learning through associating different stimuli, like having an immense sense of panic every time you hear your phone ring because you associate that sound with being yelled at by your drunken ex-boss, sworn nemesis, long-lost third cousin, twice forsaken, or whatever. Classical conditioning normally occurs when you are exposed to two stimuli around the same time and learn to associate them with one another. The thing is, we don't actually have to be exposed to these stimuli for learning to occur. We can learn classically conditioned responses from other people. Think about snakes, for instance. Are we scared of snakes because they're inherently scary? Maybe, but snakes look an awful lot like worms on steroids or godforsaken lizards. Yet we don't find worms or lizards scary. So is a fear of snakes a conditioned response? Well, it might be if you've been bitten by a snake before, but many people who are scared of snakes have never even seen one in real life. So how is that fear learned? Is it innate, or is it perhaps social? Have we somehow learned to fear snakes simply because everyone else seems to fear them? Well, it could be both, or something else entirely, but hopefully it's becoming apparent that radical behaviorism is not a complete explanation for people's behaviour. Something was missing from the equation. So in comes a man named Albert Bandura, who proposes a new way of thinking about why things do the things they do. Bandura proposed social learning theory, which argues that learning is a cognitive process that takes place within social contexts. He acknowledges the contributions of behaviorism, but doesn't limit learning to the sum of stimuli and outcomes. Instead, he posits that learning actively involves thoughts and beliefs, and can be driven by social factors. In 1977, Albert Bandura published his book, Social Learning Theory, in which he set out the 5 key tenets of, social learning theory. First, he argues that learning is not purely behavioural, but involves cognitions too. Second, he proposes vicarious reinforcement, which states that new behaviours can be learned by witnessing the consequences of other people's actions, not just our own. Third, he proposes a process called observational learning, in which individuals learn new behaviours by observing the behaviours of others and choosing to copy them. Fourth, he acknowledges that reinforcement does play a role in learning, but is not purely responsible for it. And fifth, he proposes reciprocal determinism, the process by which an individual's beliefs, behaviours, and environment all reinforce each other. That's a lot, so we're going to go through each of those 5 tenets in a bit more detail to understand exactly what Bandura is getting at. First up is the idea that learning is not a purely behavioural phenomenon, but is instead a cognitive process. This means that humans, unfortunately, do not have preordained input-output scripts that they are destined to follow, but are instead cursed with sentience and the ability to think about things, which impacts the ways in which they interact with the world. As an example of what I'm getting at, consider the fact that being classically conditioned to have a fear response to your phone's ringtone only works if you pay attention to your phone. Someone who is always busy with something else and never even registers that their phone is ringing won't experience much, if any, conditioning, while someone who is hyper-focused on their phone will. The environmental stimuli are the same in both situations. The only difference between the two is at a cognitive level. Consider also the role our perceptions can play in learning. Perhaps I find my ringtone anxiety-inducing not because of classical conditioning, but because I view my phone as a tool only used for emergencies. So if it's ringing, something must be wrong. I would have a very different emotional response to my phone ringing than someone who views their phone as a funny little dopamine machine. But in reality, the actual stimuli are the same. The only difference is how I think about those stimuli, how I conceptualize them. That is what is changing my response. The second tenet of social learning theory is the concept of vicarious reinforcement. Vicarious reinforcement refers to learning by observing the consequences of other people's behaviours. In other words, watching someone else experience operant conditioning has an effect on me as the observer. If I see someone receive a reward for a behaviour, I will copy that behaviour. But if I see someone get punished for it, I'll make sure not to do it myself. Like with most concepts in the psychology of learning, the easiest example here is to picture a classroom. If I, being the 9-year-old I am, observe one of my fellow children being rewarded for cleaning up, such as with a raspberry-scented sticker, then I will be more eager to help clean up too. On the flip side, if I see one of my buddies get yelled at for licking the teacher's feet, which is an actual thing that happens in classrooms, then I will likely stop that behaviour myself. For the sake of the argument, of course. So, yeah, vicarious learning has massive ramifications for educational and child-rearing contexts. It might help explain why certain kids follow instructions better than others, for instance. Perhaps the troublemaker has seen other kids get away with misbehaving, whilst the rule follower has seen the consequences of disobeying orders. In either case, the behaviours they've observed have influenced their own. Which leads us into the third tenet of social learning theory, observational learning. Observational learning is very similar to and involves vicarious reinforcement. It refers to when we learn new behaviours by, observing other people and choosing to copy them. Bandura famously demonstrated observational learning in the 60s through what's now called the Bobo doll experiment. In the Bobo doll experiment, children were shown an adult playing with a blow-up doll called a Bobo doll. In one third of the trials, the adult played with the doll gently. In another third, they were violent, attacking the doll and calling it names. And the final group served as a control condition. Once the children had seen the adult playing with the doll, they were taken to a room full of toys and told they could play with whatever they wanted. 2 minutes into playing, however, the experimenter came in and told them that they were not, in fact, allowed to play with the toys, as these toys were reserved for special children only. The child, now frustrated, was taken back to the original room with the Bobo doll. What Bandura found was that children who had observed the aggressive adult at the start were substantially more likely to take their frustration out against the Bobo doll than children in the other groups. They were more physically and verbally aggressive towards the poor doll. In other words, the children had learned violent behaviours through nothing more than the powers of observation. There was no reward for being violent here, but simply by observing the adult model and emulating their behaviour, the child had learned violent behaviours that they likely never would have exhibited otherwise. Furthermore, the children who observed the aggressive model exhibited aggressive behaviours that the model did not, meaning that they didn't just rote learn the behaviours, they learned the intent and came up with new ways to express their frustration through violence. This, of course, has massive ramifications for how we learn violent behaviours in the real world. After all, if simply watching adults do violent things is enough for children to become violent themselves, then perhaps children who grow up in violent households will themselves grow into violent adults. Not to mention, if violence can be learned through mere observation, then surely other problematic behaviours, like emotional manipulation, relational dishonesty, selfishness, and dog-ear bookmarking, can be learned too. If this is the case, then it becomes imperative that the people who are around children the most parents, caretakers, and teachers model good behaviours for their children to emulate. They are actively shaping the future generations with each and every behaviour they perform, meaning that if they act like morons where children can see them, then the next generation will, sure enough, be moronic. It is this exact concept that, through a hop, skip, trip and stumble, leads itself into alarmism about violent media. After all, if children can learn violent behaviours by watching other people act violently, then surely watching violent movies or playing violent video games will teach them to be violent too. It's the same idea, isn't it? Well, we'll get to that, but in the meantime, Bandura made a few other interesting observations about the Bobo doll experiment. For one thing, he noticed that children more often emulated an adult model that was the same gender as them. Boys were more likely to copy men, and girls were more likely to copy women. From this, he extrapolated that we are more likely to model the behaviour of those around us who we perceive to be similar to us. The word perceive is important here because it signals yet another cognitive element to the theory. It doesn't matter how similar the observer and the model are in reality, it matters how similar the observer thinks they are. And if the observer thinks they are alike, then they're more likely to copy their behaviour, for better or worse. But we don't copy every behaviour we see, do we? We observe all sorts of different people exhibiting all sorts of different behaviours around us all the time. If we emulated every single thing all of them did, we would be a confused mess of a person. Just because I see a person bobsledding down a busy highway in a runaway fridge doesn't mean I decide to join them. So how do we decide who to copy and who not to? Well, Bandura proposed 4 main cognitive processes necessary for us to emulate a behaviour. First, we must pay attention to the behaviour, which is influenced by the characteristics of both the observer and the behaviour being observed. For instance, if I'm tired, I will probably pay less attention than if I just drank 2 dozen Red Bulls. My energy levels impact how much attention I pay, and thus how effectively I learn. On the flip side, if I witness a behaviour I think is important, such as a self-defense demonstration that could save my life, or a really great pickup line, then I will pay more attention to it than if I'm forced to watch something I don't think is important, like a competitive drying paint watcher demonstrating their craft. The behaviour I'm observing influences how likely I am to pay attention to it. Secondly, we must retain the concept of the behaviour in our memory. In other words, we need to remember the behaviour. If the behaviour is clearly modelled for me and I think about it frequently, then I will remember it better than if I don't. The third process is reproduction, which refers to the physical and mental capacity to perform the behaviour we've observed. It's all well and good for me to observe a master martial artist perform a quadruple flying anterior reverse crane inverse butterfly back axe distal round knee side kick, but if I don't have the physical ability to reproduce that behaviour, then I'm never going to actually exhibit it. On the flip side, watching paint dry is a behaviour I can reproduce, so observational learning is much more likely to occur when I'm watching a professional drying paint watcher than a professional pretend martial artist. Finally, I must have sufficient motivation to perform the behaviour. I can pay attention to a drying paint watcher, I can retain my memory of how they did it, and I can have the physical capacity to perform the behaviour. But if I have no reason to, I won't. In order to complete the learning process and demonstrate my new behaviour, I must have an actual reason to show off my learning. And this is where vicarious reinforcement fits in. If I've seen people get rewarded for watching paint dry, then I'll be more likely to do it myself than if I've only ever seen people driven to the edge of sanity by it. And this takes us back to Bandura and the Bobo doll, because whether the children copied the adult's violent behaviour seems to depend on their motivation too. In 1965, Bandura conducted a variation on the initial experiment, in which the children were split into 3 groups. A reward group, in which the adult was praised by a researcher for attacking the doll, a punishment group, in which they were, punished, and a control group. In this variation of the experiment, those who watched the model get punished for their behaviour were noticeably less likely to beat up the doll, and conversely, when the children were offered rewards for attacking the doll, such as lollies or stickers, they became more aggressive. In other words, most of the children learned how to attack the doll, but only those who had been sufficiently motivated to do so actually did. This principle is why publicly punishing one misbehaving child in a class helps keep the others in line. Even if all the children know what they need to do to rile the teacher up, if they aren't given a good reason to do so, or if they're explicitly given a reason not to, then they won't do it. A behaviour can be learned, but it will only manifest if there is sufficient motivation to do so. The fourth tenet of social learning theory, yes, we are only on number 4, I swear it gets easier from here, is simply the idea that reinforcement plays a role in, but is not purely responsible for, learning. Which, yeah, obviously, we've established that by this point. If you've been given a good reason to perform a behaviour, then you're more likely to perform it than if you haven't. But at the same time, learning can occur even if you don't necessarily have a reason to perform that behaviour yet. Finally, the fifth tenet of social learning theory is the concept of reciprocal determinism, which is simply the idea that an individual's cognition, or their thoughts, their behaviour, and their environment mutually influence one another. In other words, unlike theories of classical and operant conditioning, which assume the learner is some kind of lab rat sitting there just waiting to learn new associations, social learning theory works on the assumption that we play an active role in shaping our environment. For example, let's say I decide to do something nice for someone, like pay for their groceries, a behaviour, because I think that's a good thing to do, a cognition. In response, the person remembers me and becomes all warm and friendly whenever they see me in the future, a change in the environment. That, in turn, makes me think they must be a good person, a cognition, and that makes me more likely to help them out in the future, a behaviour, which makes them warmer, a change in the environment, and so on and so forth. My thoughts, behaviours, and environment all influence each other in turn. So there we go. Social learning theory in a nutshell, or more accurately in 2,360 words. We've learned a bit about the history of learning psychology as a field, and we've had a bit of a look at Albert Bandura and his 5 tenets of social learning theory: cognition, vicarious reinforcement, observational learning, regular reinforcement, and reciprocal determinism. In particular, we zoomed in on observational learning, which requires 4 processes to occur. We must pay attention, we must retain the behaviour, we must be able to reproduce it, and we must have motivation to do so. And finally, we spoke about the Bobo doll study. That's social learning theory. Congrats for making it this far. Make sure you use this knowledge to cripple the next generation wisely. Just remember, if you ever need to violently assault a blow-up clown doll, please do it where little eyes can't see. They don't need the bad influence. So with that out of the way, we can now turn back to the matter at hand. If watching an adult assault a clown turns children into clownicidal maniacs, then surely watching Doom Guy eviscerate demons or Master Chief blast at aliens makes them more aggressive, right? At least a little bit? Well, strap in and prepare yourself for the cold, hard truth about violent video games. So, we've got a pretty simple yes or no question on our hands to answer. Does consuming violent media make you more violent? It seems straightforward enough. It makes intuitive sense that playing violent games all day would make you at least a little bit more violent. But what does the science actually say about it? Well, having surveyed the existing research on the topic, I can confidently report the definitive answer in a single word. I don't think I've ever come across a topic as weirdly divisive as this one. You'd think people would be more preoccupied with, anything else, but apparently not. I've read articles confidently asserting that there is no link between violent video games and real-world violence whatsoever, and anyone who claims that there is a coal-munching, lead-drinking, out-of-touch alarmist boomer who wouldn't know fun if it stole their dentures. Then I'll open the very next article only to be told that there is, in fact, a definitive causal link between violent media and violent behaviour, and anyone who disagrees is a self-absorbed, short-form content-addicted, brain-rot-addled plague baby who is just making excuses so that they can keep feeding their vile urges. Which is a very Freudian concept now that I think about it. But whatever, I'm letting Dr. Daddy issues distract me. The point is, what gives? What's going on here, and why are people so willing to die on both sides of this hill? Well, let's take a step back for a minute. What is the theoretical basis for assuming that violent media consumption and violent behaviour are related? Well, social learning theory, or more specifically, the Bobo doll experiment. If children can learn to be violent by watching an adult act violently, then surely they'll become more violent if they watch someone on a screen act violently too. And sure enough, in 1963, Bandura conducted a variation on his initial experiment in which he tested just that. In this version of the experiment, some of the children watched a filmed or cartoon model rather than a real person. As it turns out, these children also exhibited increased aggression, as if they had seen the model in real life. So there we go. Case closed. Watching someone act violent on a screen leads to real-world violence. Bandura proved this back in the 60s. Why are we still arguing about it? Well, because there were, as is usually the case with these things, problems with Bandura's study. I mean, first of all, how valid of a measure of aggression is the Bobo doll? Just because a child is willing to beat up a doll doesn't necessarily mean that they'll attack other people. Besides, a Bobo doll is an unusual item, so perhaps the kids simply assumed that was how you were supposed to use it, the same way a boxing bag is used for punching. There are heaps of behaviours we perform all the time, ranging from martial arts classes to high school dodgeball, that are certainly aggressive, but are a far cry from the violent crime that video games are often blamed for. Also, Bandura's studies used children. That's another factor to consider. Children have underdeveloped prefrontal cortexes. That's not a diss, it's just facts. So of course they're going to copy what adults do without thinking too much about the implications. They're kids. Even if Bandura's study definitively proved that violent media leads to violent behaviour, which it doesn't, that would still only apply to children below a certain age, and that age would vary between children, because children naturally vary in their maturity. Not to mention, there are so many other factors at play in a real-world setting that simply aren't present in a controlled experiment. Cartoons might be capable of modelling aggression, but what about other forms of media? Video games, music, podcasts, books, and so on. People are quick to point the finger at the dang video games, but what about violent watercolour paintings or unnecessarily aggressive haikus? Are they a problem too? Also, we know that vicarious reinforcement plays a role in observational learning, but does that transfer over to media? Children appear to be less likely to model an adult who gets punished for their aggression, so is violence in media okay as long as the violent character is punished? And what about other problematic behaviours in media too? There's plenty of music out there that's objectifying and degrading. Does listening to Too Short make you more likely to become a misogynist? My point isn't that we should be mandating 5-year-olds watch Kill Bill instead of Bluey, just that these discussions very quickly become very messy. There are so many variables and factors at play here, so how are we ever supposed to find a satisfying answer? Well, in short, maybe we can't. We probably won't ever have a perfectly definitive, all-encompassing answer. That's just the nature of science. But that doesn't mean there aren't clues to point us in the right direction. Perhaps the best place to start here is in the year 2000, when the American Psychological Association, or APA, put out a press release in which they claimed that playing violent video games may lead to increased aggression, and that video games were specifically more problematic than other forms of media because they were more immersive and engaging, requiring the player to take on the role of the violent protagonist rather than simply witnessing it, like in a book or movie. This claim was based off of an article published that same year in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which reported the results of 2 studies. The first of these studies was a correlational study that involved measuring an individual's exposure to violent video games and their aggressive and delinquent behaviours, and seeing if there was a relationship between the two. The second study was an experimental study that involved participants being exposed to a violent game in the lab, then having their aggression measured. Both of these studies reported more or less the same results, that playing violent video games is, in fact, associated with and potentially causes aggressive behaviour. So there we go. That's our answer, straight from the APA. Except it's not, because heaps of studies were conducted after that, testing those findings, and although many of them found similar results, some of them didn't. For instance, C.J. Ferguson and colleagues from 2008 specifically conducted 2 studies, a correlational study and an experimental study, just like in the APA paper, and didn't find a relationship between violent video games and aggression. Instead, they argued that family violence and innate aggression were better predictors of crime, which, yeah, obviously, but I don't care about family violence, I care about the dang video games. Not to mention, in 2009, C.J. Ferguson, yes, the same C.J. Ferguson, authored a meta-analysis, or a review of studies, with another psychologist named Jay Kilburn, which found that, no, actually there wasn't a good association here. The effect size was tiny, and most of the papers that had been published on the topic were biased or had poor methods. This was nothing more than a moral panic driven by political ideology. The end. Except the APA seemed to disagree, because in August of 2015, they published a technical report of their own, reviewing previous meta-analyses up until 2009 and 31 more studies published since then. And what did they find? Well, obviously that there was an overwhelming, crystal clear association between exposure to violent video games and aggressive behaviours, thoughts and feelings in older children, adolescents and young adults, and sure, the research in children below the age of 10 is lacking and the samples aren't super representative, but the results are clear, okay, why are we still arguing about this? Now, if you're a nerd, you might be thinking, thanks, APA, that sounds pretty comprehensive. But didn't Ferguson just say that there wasn't a clear link? Even if there is an association between video games and aggression, how do we know that it was the video games that caused the aggression, not the other way around? Or alternatively, what if we got these things wrong and there's some other variable, like, say, depression or psychopathy, that contributes to both video game consumption and aggression? And whilst that's certainly possible, the APA argues that it isn't likely, for a number of reasons. First, many of the studies they reviewed did measure other variables that might explain the relationship, such as age, gender, and previous aggression. And although they did have an effect, they didn't fully explain the relationship between violent video games and aggression, suggesting that the games do, in fact, play a role. Furthermore, some of the studies included were laboratory experiments, in which other variables were mostly controlled for, and still others were longitudinal studies that took years to complete, rather than just an afternoon in a lab, meaning that they could clearly establish that the video games came before the aggression, not the other way around. The APA notes that none of these methods are conclusive. Science almost never is. But with so many different types of studies, all pointing to the same conclusion, the answer seems obvious. Inevitable, even. The gamers out there might not like it, but that's the truth of it. Video games cause, at least in part, violent behaviour. And that, my friends, is the end of the episode. Except no, it's not, because only 1 month later, C.J. Ferguson dropped another paper, this time analysing the results of 101 studies, demonstrating that no, the relationship is not clear, the effects, where they exist, are tiny, and we should really be spending our time and money on something more useful, like mental health or family violence interventions, rather than freaking out about the dang video games. So, sensing an impasse, some authors tried to find a middle ground that everyone could accept. And by some authors, I mean a weird amount of authors. Mather and colleagues argued that perhaps there is a relationship here, it's just a small one, which is why some studies seem to find an effect whilst others don't, which is supported by Martins and Weaver, who found a small positive effect of media violence on aggression, and Shao and colleagues, who found a small negative effect of violent video game consumption on pro-social behaviour, not to mention Coyne and colleagues, who found that exposure to sexual media was associated with risky sexual behaviour. So surely a similar principle applies to aggressive behaviours, and also, by the way, all of those studies were meta-analyses conducted in 2019 alone. You want to know who else published a paper in 2019? That's right, C.J. Ferguson dropped another study, this time a longitudinal study following 3,034 Singaporean youth across 2 years, concluding that no, there is no significant association to speak of, and a child would have to spend 27 hours a day gaming for it to have any noticeable effect on their behaviour. So there, can we please stop wasting our time on this inane, humiliating topic and start researching stuff that actually matters? 3 months later, the APA released an updated resolution in which they reviewed another 108 studies and concluded that, sure, the effect is small, and policymakers claiming that video games are causing mass shootings are talking nonsense, but the link is there, and none of the studies conducted since 2015 disprove anything in that report, so there. Do you want to guess what happens next? In 2020, C.J. Ferguson dropped another meta-analysis, this time directly responding to the APA's 2015 resolution, claiming that the relationship is negligible and the effect sizes are elevated by poor research practices and researcher expectancy bias, and I am losing my mind. This is such a simple question. It has an obvious theoretical basis. It makes intuitive sense, so why can't we seem to reach an answer? The year is 3100. Mankind has long been decimated by nuclear war. The Earth is unrecognizable, an alien abomination ravaged by climate change and a seemingly never-ending onslaught of nuclear radiation. All signs of our once mighty civilization have long been razed from the universe, with no witnesses left to testify to the heights we once reached, apart, of course, from a single soul by the name of C.J. Ferguson, who recently published his 963rd response on the issue of violent media. No one knows who these responses are addressed to, but of course, apart from C.J. Ferguson, no one is left to know. But here in the 21st century, what are we to make of this dilemma? Is there a relationship here? Is it reliable? Is it meaningful? Is it causal? And what do we do about it? Design a harsher rating system? Ban video games? Ban politicians? Ban science? Okay. First things first, is there a meaningful positive relationship between exposure to violent video games and aggressive behaviour that cannot be easily explained by other factors? Well, as much as I respect C.J. Ferguson's commitment to the one-man army, I'm going to go out on a limb and say, probably. This is, of course, a contentious topic, so keep in mind that my opinion is not reflective of any professional body, much less the science or what have you. But I do think the majority of studies here do seem to suggest that there is a relationship that cannot be easily explained by other factors. I'll include the reviews I used to reach this conclusion in the description of this episode, so do your own research. But I do think that the majority of studies by the majority of theorists seem to support the APA's conclusion, that violent video games are associated with increased aggression, but that this effect is small and is with aggression, not violent crime, as some public figures like to claim. I could, of course, be wrong about this, and I'm happy to accept that, but trying to argue that there is no relationship whatsoever definitely puts you in the minority. So, why is there so much discrepancy here? Hundreds of studies have been conducted on the topic, so much time and effort has been invested, and the best answer we can come up with is probably? Why? Well, there are a couple of possible explanations. Bushman and Anderson argue in a 2023 paper titled Solving the Puzzle of Null Violent Media Effects that there could be a number of issues at hand. For instance, maybe these studies are relying on too small sample sizes. If you only measure an effect in 5 people, then it's entirely possible you won't find anything. Not because there isn't anything to find, but because you're only looking at 5 people. But these studies finding no effect didn't have 5 participants. They had thousands. So what else could be at work here? Maybe we're using the wrong type of measurements. Bushman and Anderson suggest that perhaps these studies are using trait measures, which measure traits or stable personality characteristics, rather than state measures, which measure a characteristic in a particular situation. Playing a violent video game might not substantially change a person's total aggression, but it might make them more aggressive in particular circumstances. Similarly, perhaps this effect only occurs in children who are already predisposed to violence, hence why some studies found an effect whilst others didn't. Then again, on the opposite side of the aisle, C.J. Ferguson has argued that there isn't an effect, and when researchers appear to find results, it's likely due to researcher expectancy. In other words, because the researchers expect to find a relationship, they seek one out, and don't gather or interpret the data impartially. And here's the kicker. Even if there is an effect, it might not be due to social learning theory. Remember social learning theory? The thing that this episode was supposed to be about? Yeah, we may have been wasting our time here anyway. Some theorists have argued that playing violent video games causes aggressive behaviour not because of some kind of monkey-see, monkey-do observational learning, but because observing violence desensitizes people to it, which makes them less aversive to using aggression in the future. There's also a cognitive element at play. Perhaps consuming violent media makes people more aware of the violent options available to solve problems, and thus more likely to rely on those options. Alternatively, maybe consuming violent media gives people a negative outlook on the world, and because they believe that the world is a hostile, violent place, they become more violent in response. At the end of the day, though, I think this exercise has taught us more about the nature of science than it has about social learning theory. We like to think of science as this objective, inscrutable arbiter of truth, but it really isn't. People on the internet love to claim that according to science, or science says that whatever, but the truth of the matter is that science doesn't say anything. Scientists say things, and very often those things are estimated guesses at best and downright contradictions at worst. That's not to say that we should throw science out or distrust what scientists say, just to put things in perspective. Science is a great tool, but tools don't fix cars. People do. But as far as video games are concerned, and as much of a massive cop-out as it is for me to say this, I think there's a grain of truth on both sides of this divide. Those claiming that violent video games contribute to aggression certainly have the vast majority of the evidence on their side, and I think there's something to be said about the role violence plays in our media these days. Don't get me wrong, I love action games as much as the next guy, but why is there such a massive focus on slaying monsters and shooting people? Video games can be heaps of fun without featuring violence at all. The sheer existence of puzzle and racing games proves this. Yet the vast majority of video games rely on combat as a central part of their main gameplay loop. And this complaint isn't just about video games. Popular movies and books often have an obsession with violence too. To be clear, I don't have a problem with that in and of itself, but I can't help but wonder how many creative works of art have been stifled by the assumption that they have to include action. Why is almost every work of fantasy also a work of action? Why does every cool magic system have to be used for killing people? Why can't we have more video games where the fate of the world is determined through solitaire? I don't think violence in media is wrong. On the contrary, I think it can be used to great effect. But I also think that we as a culture have an unhealthy obsession with violence that demonstrates not a moral decay so much as a lack of imagination. And sure, there is without a doubt a case to be made for why our media rating systems should be tightened up to provide better recommendations for families who want to make sure that the content their children consume is age appropriate. As it stands, in spite of the, at times, inconsistent results in the literature, I still think it's valid for parents to be cautious about letting their children consume violent content, especially in the age of the internet, where controlling what children are exposed to is extremely difficult. I think many of us forget just how young children are exposed to the internet these days, and what sorts of effects that unfiltered exposure can have. Hell, it's entirely possible that there are children listening to this podcast right now. In which case, hi, hope you're doing well. Tell your parents you love them. At the same time, I think it's a massive leap to take these results and apply them to real-world violent crime. Laboratory aggression is one thing, but claiming that video games cause real-world shootings is, for the most part, unfounded and ignores the true determinants of violent crime. Violent crime is driven by a host of interacting characteristics, including personality, innate aggression, mental health, socioeconomic status, and access to weapons. Claiming that Call of Duty is the cause of gun violence is not only absurd, it's also a waste of oxygen that could be spent talking about mental health interventions, or community support, or gun control, or any of the other solutions that would actually help the situation. Framing the conversation around violence media is a distraction from the real problem, because it's easier to ban video games than it is to, address the state of mental health. So there we go. Countless hours of research and 7,000 odd words later, let's try this one last time. Do violent video games cause violence? Very much for listening. I feel like I spent more time this episode talking about how research works than how social learning theory works, which isn't ideal, but it's just how things go sometimes. I still have a lot of thoughts on social learning theory, and in particular media consumption. One thing I touched upon today that I'd love to talk about at length some other time is the internalization of misogynistic content. After all, behaviour is one thing, but can consuming sexist media change your thoughts too? I don't know. To be completely honest, researching this episode has made me question whether we can ever know anything from a scientific perspective. To be honest, I don't feel especially optimistic about the answer to that question, especially in the current climate. This is a psychology podcast, so it's almost inevitable that we'll cover the replication crisis one of these days. So I won't go into too much detail here, but essentially, the replication crisis is a movement that started in psychology but has since expanded to other fields, including medicine, economics, and the natural sciences, in which many landmark studies can't be reproduced, either because they physically can't be repeated within ethical guidelines, or because when they are repeated, the results are different. Which is, concerning because it means it is entirely possible that massive bodies of scientific work have been built upon erroneous assumptions. But oh well. I am not a professional, and the only advice I will ever give you on this podcast is to do your own research and come to your own conclusions. I can't give you an answer. But hopefully coming on this journey with me has kept you entertained, at least for a little while. This show is written, performed, and produced by me. Music by Matt Ponio. This show is not violent, but educational, and I hope listening to it has not made you more aggressive, but more understanding.